Hello and Merry Christmas. My name is John Ferris. I'm a retired United Methodist minister living in North Canton, Ohio, and I have a gift for you. It is a gift I have shared through all of my ministry, and even before and after. It is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Any good storyteller will encourage his or her listeners to use their imagination and their memories in the story that they hear. So, while you and I are together connected by electronic mystery, I invite you to recall all of the Dickens Christmas carols that you have seen on stage, on the small screen, on the large screen, and no matter what version it is, you can bring up those pictures while I use my face and voice to tell the story and prod your memories. Where did I get the gift from? I got it from my grandfather. My grandfather was Delbert G. Lean, professor of speech at the College of Worcester for a long time, from about 1910 to 1947. And he shared with the college community and the Worcester community this gift of A Christmas Carol every season. Oh, where did he get the gift from? He got the gift from a small book he picked up in a used bookstore in Boston, Massachusetts. He was there in 2008 or 9, studying for his master's at Emerson College. It was a small book of Dickens' condensations of his books that Dickens himself used for his public readings. My grandfather focused on a carol and somewhat edited it and brought it back to Worcester and shared it. One Sunday night in December during the Depression, he drove from Worcester, Ohio to Canton, Ohio to share his gift with the folks at the Presbyterian Church on West Tuscarawas Avenue. Sam Stone, a Canton businessman, was there in the audience and heard the story and wondered to himself what he could do to make a small difference in people's lives. The next morning, he took out a small ad in the Canton Repository, inviting people to write to him anonymously their story and their needs, and he would help them with their Christmas. He opened an anonymous checking account and sent them a check. They wrote letters of thanks and gratitude back to him. The letters were collected by Sam's daughter, and many years later, she gave them to her son, Ted Gupp. Ted Gupp read the letters, found out the story, and wrote a secret gift that was published a number of years ago. Ted Gupp is on the faculty of Emerson College in Boston, where my grandfather, 100 and more years ago, got his master's and the small book. It is my joy and my honor and my privilege to share with you this wondrous gift. Marley was dead to begin with. There was no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, his sole mourner. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name, however. There it yet stood years afterwards above the warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge, and sometimes Marley. He answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted, hand-of-the-grindstone Scrooge. a squeezing, wrenching, scraping, grasping, clutching, covetous old sinner. External heat and cold had little influence on him. No cold could chill him, no warmth could warm. No wind that blew was bitterer than he, no pelting rain less open to entreaty, no falling snow more intent upon its purpose. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest snow and sleet and rain and hail could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely. Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him on the streets to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggar implored him to bestow a trifle. No child ever asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman in all his life ever asked the way of such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails, as though to say, no eye at all is better than an evil-eyed dark master. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of human life, wanting all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones called nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good times in the year, upon a Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting, foggy weather. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. Scrooge had a very small fire in his grate, but the clerk's fire was so much smaller that it looked like one coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal bucket in his own room. And so surely as the clerk came in with a shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Whereupon the clerk put on his white comforter and attempted to warm himself at a candle, at which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle!" It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who had burst in upon him so suddenly. This was the first intimation Scrooge had of his approach. "Bah, humbug! Christmas a humbug, Uncle? You don't mean that, I am sure." "I do. Out upon Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without any money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer? A time for balancing your books and having every item through a round dozen of months presented against you? If I had my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should." "Uncle!" "Nephew, keep Christmas in your own way. Let me keep it in mine." "Keep it? But you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone then. Much good has it done you? Much good has it ever done you?" "Well, there are many things from which I have derived good, but which I have not profited. I dare say Christmas among them. But I am sure that I have always thought of Christmas time when it came round as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, benevolent time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when people seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely and look at people below them as if they really were fellow travelers to the grave and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And so, dear Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. "Let me hear another sound from you, and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation." "You're quite a powerful speaker, sir. I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge said that he would see him Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of that expression and said that he would see him in that extremity first. But why? Why did you get married? Because I fell in love. Because you fell in love? Good afternoon. Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why use it as an excuse for not coming now? Good afternoon. I am very sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have not had a quarrel to which I have been a part. I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends? Good afternoon. Well, I've made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. A Merry Christmas, uncle. Good afternoon, and a Happy New Year. Good afternoon. The nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. The clerk, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let two other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and stood in Scrooge's office with their hats in their hands. They had books and papers under their arms. Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley? Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years. Died 7 years ago, this very night, at this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge. It is more than usually desirable that we should make some provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at the present time. Thousands are in want of common comforts, sir. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common necessaries. Are there no prisons? Oh, plenty of prisons, sir, but under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind and body to the unoffending multitude, a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund to give the poor some food and drink and means of warmth. Yes. We choose this time because it is a time of all others, sir, when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for? Nothing. Oh, you wish to be anonymous? I wish to be left alone. Since you ask me what my wish is, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help support the prisons and the workhouses. They cost enough. And those who are badly off must go there. Many would rather not go there, sir, and many would rather die. Well, if they'd rather die, they'd better do it and decrease the surplus population. At length, the hour of closing the counting house arrived. With an ill-willed Scrooge, dismounting from his stool, tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed out his candle and put on his hat. You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose, if quite convenient, sir. It's not convenient, and it's not fair. You'd think yourself mightily ill-used, I'll be bound, if I was to stop half a crown for it. Yes, sir. And yet you don't think me ill-used for paying a day's wages for no work? It's only once a year, sir. A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket. Very well, I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning. The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honor of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home as hard as he could pelt to play at blind man's buff. Scrooge took his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening in his banker's book, went home to bed. He lived in quarters which had once belonged to his deceased partner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms in a lowering pile of building up a yard. They were dreary enough, old enough, nobody living in them but Scrooge, the other rooms all let out as offices. Now, it is a fact that there is nothing at all particular about the door knocker on this house, except that it was very large. Also, that Scrooge had seen it night and morning during his whole residence of that place. Also, that Scrooge had as little of what could be called fancy as any man in the city of London. And yet Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, saw in the knocker, without its undergoing any intermediate process of change, not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face, with a dismal light about it, like a bad lobster in a dark cellar. It was not angry or ferocious, but it looked at Scrooge as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up upon its ghostly forehead. As Scrooge looked fixedly at this phenomenon, it became a door knocker again. He said, "Pooh, pooh," and closed the door with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs, slowly too, trimming his candle as he went. Up Scrooge went, not caring a button for its being very dark. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge liked it. But before he shut his heavy door, he walked through his rooms to see that everything was right. He had just enough recollection of the face to desire to do that. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the sofa. Nobody under the table. A small fire in the grate. Saucepan of gruel. Scrooge had a cold upon his head on the hob. Spoon and basin ready. Nobody under his bed. Nobody in his closet. Nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Lumber room as usual. Washing stand on 3 legs, old rubber boots, old fish baskets, and a poker. Quite satisfied, he closed the door and locked himself in. Double locked himself in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he took off his cravat, put on his nightcap and slippers, and sat before the low fire to take his gruel. As he threw his head back in the chair, his glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell, which hung in the room and communicated for some purpose now forgotten with a chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and a strange, inexplicable dread that as he looked at this bell, it began to swing. Soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. This was succeeded by a clanking noise deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellars. Then he heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards his door. On it came through the heavy door, and a specter passed into the room before his eyes. And upon its coming in, the dying flame leaped up as though it cried, "I know him, Marley's ghost." Marley's face, the same face. Marley in his usual pigtail waistcoat, tights, and boots. His body was transparent, so that Scrooge, observing him and looking through him, could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Scrooge had often heard it said that Marley had no bowels, but he didn't believe it. No, nor did he believe it now. Though he looked the phantom through and saw it standing before him. Though he noticed the very texture of the kerchief bound around its head and chin. Though he felt the chilling influence of its death-cold eyes upon him, he was still incredulous. "How now? What do you want with me?" "Much." Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you then?" "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you Can you sit down? I can. Do it then. Scrooge asked the question because he didn't know whether a ghost so transparent could find himself in a condition to take a chair, and felt that in the event of its being impossible, it might involve the necessity of an embarrassing explanation. But the ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fire as if he were quite used to it. You don't believe in me? No, I don't. What evidence would you have of my reality beyond that of your senses? I don't know. Why do you doubt your senses? A little thing affects them. Slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheats. You might be a bit of beef, a blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, or a fragment of an underdone potato. Whatever you are, there's more of gravy than of grave. Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, nor did he feel in his heart waggis them. The truth of the matter is he was trying to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his horror. But how much greater was his horror when the phantom, taking the kerchief bound around its head and chin, as if it were too warm to wear indoors, its lower jaw dropped down upon its breast. Mercy, dreadful apparition! Why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to haunt me? It is required of every person that at some time the spirit within should walk abroad among fellow human beings and travel far and wide. And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. I cannot tell you all I would. Very little more is permitted of me, mark me. My spirit never left our counting house. In life, my spirit never roved the narrow limits of our money-changing hole, and weary, weary journeys lie before me. 7 years dead and traveling all the time? You travel fast, Jacob, on the wings of the wind. You must have got over a great quantity of ground in 7 years, Jacob. Oh, blind man, not to know that ages of incessant labor by immortal creatures for this earth must pass into eternity before the good of which it is susceptible is all developed. Not to know that any Christian spirit, working kindly in its little sphere, wherever it might be, will find its mortal life too short for its vast means of usefulness. And I was once like this man. You were always a good man of business, Jacob. Business! Humankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Mercy, charity, forbearance, benevolence were all my business. Scrooge was much dismayed to hear the ghost going on at this rate. Began to quake exceedingly. Hear me, my time is nearly gone. I will, Jacob, but don't be hard upon me. Don't be flowery, pray. I come tonight to warn you that you have a hope and chance of my procuring, a hope and chance of escaping my fate. You were always a good friend to me, thank you. You will be haunted by 3 spirits. Is that the hope and chance you mentioned, Jacob? I think I'd rather not. With their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread. Expect the first tomorrow night when the bell tolls 1. Expect the next night at the same hour. The third, the next night when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and look that for your own sake you remember what has passed between us. It walked backward from him, and at every step it took, it raised itself a little, so that when the spirit reached the window, it was wide open. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked as he'd locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. Scrooge tried to say, "Humbug," but stopped at the first syllable. And being from the fatigues of the day, or the glimpse of the invisible world, or the dull conversation of the ghost, or the lateness of the hour. Much in need of repose, he went straight to bed without undressing and fell asleep on the instant. When Scrooge awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish the transparent windows from the opaque walls of his chamber, until suddenly the church clock tolled a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy 1. Light flashed up in the room upon the instant, and the curtains of his bed were drawn aside by a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man, viewed through some supernatural medium, which gave him the appearance of being receded from the view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which was white as if with age, hung about its head and down its neck. It didn't have a wrinkle on its face, but it had gray hair that hung down its neck and down its back. It held in its hand a branch of fresh green holly, and in singular contradiction to this wintry emblem, had its dress trimmed with summer flowers. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprang a bright, clear jet of light, by which all this was visible, and which was doubtless for its using in its duller moments a great extinguisher for a cap, which it now held under its arm. "Are you the spirit, sir, whose coming was foretold to me?" "I am." "Who and what are you?" "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" "No, your past. The things that we will see are shadows of the things that have been. They will have no consciousness of us. What business brought you here?" "Your welfare. Rise and walk with me." It would have been in vain for Scrooge to plead that the hour and the weather were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his dressing gown, nightcap, and slippers. The grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, was not to be resisted. He rose, but seeing that the ghost made towards the window, clasped its robe in supplication. I'm a mortal and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand there," said the spirit, laying it upon his heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." They passed through the walls of the room and stood in the busy thoroughfares of a city. It was made plain enough by the dressing of the shops that here, too, it was Christmas time. Scrooge and the ghost passed on invisible and stopped at a certain warehouse door. The ghost asked Scrooge if he knew it. "Know it? Was I apprenticed here?" They went in. At sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig, sitting behind such a high desk that if he'd been 2 inches taller, he must have bumped his head against the ceiling, Scrooge cried out in great excitement, "Why, it's old Fezziwig! Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again!" Old Fezziwig laid down his pen, looked at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7, adjusted his capacious waistcoat, laughed all over himself, and called out in a rich, comfortable, jovial, oily voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick." A living and moving picture of Scrooge's former self, a young man, came briskly in, closely followed by his fellow prentice. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure, my old fellow prentice. Dick was very much attached to me, was Dick. Poor Dick, dear, dear." "No more work tonight, my boys. Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Clear away, my lads. Let's have the shutters up and lots of room here." Clear away? There was nothing they wouldn't have cleared away or couldn't have cleared away with old Fezziwig looking on. It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as though dismissed from public life forever. The floor was swept and watered. Fuel was heaped upon the fire. The lamps were trimmed. And the warehouse became as bright and dry and a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. In came a fiddler, went up to that lofty desk and made an orchestra of it and tuned like 50 stomach aches. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came the 3 Miss Fezziwigs, beaming and lovable. In came the 6 young followers, whose hearts they broke. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In came the cook with her cousin the baker. In came the housemaid with her brother's particular friend the milkman. In they all came, some shyly, some boldly, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. Away they all went, 20 couples at once, hands half round and back again, down the middle and up again, round and round, in various stages of affectionate grouping. Top couple always starting off again as soon as they got there. All top couples at last, and not a bottom one to help them. When this result was brought about, old Fezziwig, clapping his hands to stop the dance, cried out, "Well done!" And the fiddler plunged a hot face into a pot of porter, especially provided for the purpose. There were more dances, and there was negus, and there was a great piece of cold boiled, and mince pies, and plenty of beer. But the great effect of the evening came after the roast and the boiled, when the fiddler struck up Sir Roger de Coverley. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. Top couple too, with a good stiff piece of work cut out for them. 3 or 4 and 20 pair of partners. People who were not to be trifled with. People who would dance and had no notion of walking. Oh, but if there'd been twice as many, 4 times old Fezziwig would have been a match for them. And so would Mrs. Fezziwig. As for her, she was worthy to be his partner in every sense of the term. A positive light appeared to issue from Fezziwig's calves. You couldn't have predicted at any given moment what would become of them next. And when they'd gone all through the dance, advance and retire, corkscrew, thread the needle back again to your place, bow and curtsy to your partner, Fezziwig cut, and cut so deftly he appeared to wink with his legs. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door, and shaking hands individually with each person as he or she went out, wished him or her a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the 2 apprentices, they did the same to them. And thus the cheerful voices died away, and the lads were left to their beds, which were under a counter in the back shop. "A small matter," said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude. Ye have spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is it so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that, Spirit, it isn't that. He has the power to make our work a pleasure or a toil, light or burdensome. Say that his power lies in looks and deeds, in things so slight and insignificant you can't add and count them up. What then? The happiness he gives us is quite as great as if it cost a fortune." "What's the matter?" "Nothing. Something, I think." No. I should like to be able to say a word to my clerk just now. That's all. My time grows short. Quick." This was not addressed to Scrooge, nor to anyone whom he could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again he saw himself. He was older now, a man in the prime of life. He was not alone, but sat at the side of a fair young girl in a black dress, in whose eyes there were tears. "It matters little," she said to Scrooge's former self. "To you, very little. Another idol has displaced me, but if it can comfort you in times to come, as I surely would have done, I have no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" "A golden one. You fear the world too much. I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion gain engrosses you. Have I not? What then? Even if I am grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed towards you. I have never sought release from our engagement. In words, no, never. In what then? In a changed atmosphere, an altered spirit, another means to an end. If you were free today, tomorrow, yesterday, Can even I believe that you would choose a dowerless girl? Or choosing her, do I not know that repentance and regret would surely follow? I do, and I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were. Spirit, remove me, haunt me no longer. I told you these were the shadows of the things that have been. They are what they are, do not blame me. Remove me, take me back, haunt me no longer. As he struggled with the Spirit, he was aware of being overcome by an irresistible drowsiness, and further, conscious of being in his own bedroom, and he barely had time to reel to bed before he sank into a heavy sleep. When Scrooge awoke, looking out of bed, he could scarcely distinguish a great light there. His room had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were hung with such a living green, it looked a perfect grove. And such a roaring blaze went up that chimney as that petrifaction of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time, or many, many a winter season gone. Heaped upon the floor to form a kind of throne were geese, game, brawn, turkeys, great joints of meat, sucking pigs, barrels of oysters, long wreaths of sausages, immense 12th cakes, cherry-cheeked apples, juicy oranges, luscious pears, immense 12th cakes, and great bowls of punch. In easy stage upon this couch there sat a giant, glorious to behold, who held in his hand a torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and who raised it high to shed its light upon Scrooge as he came peeping round the door. Come in, and know me better, man. I am the ghost of Christmas present. Look upon me. You have never seen the likes of me before. No, I haven't. What? You've never walked forth with my younger brothers, meaning, for I am very young, my elder brothers born in these later years? I don't believe I have, Spirit. Have you many brothers? More than 1,800. Tremendous family to provide for. Spirit, I went forth last night on compulsion, and am learning a lesson which is working now. If you have aught to teach me, let me profit by it. Touch my robe. Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast, and the room and all its contents vanished instantly. And he and the Spirit stood on the streets on a snowy Christmas morning. Scrooge and the ghost passed on invisible straight to Scrooge's clerks. And on the threshold of the door, the Spirit stopped and smiled and blessed Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Think of that. Bob had but 15 bob a week himself. He pocketed on Saturdays but 15 copies of his Christian name, and yet the ghost of Christmas present blessed his 4-room house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap and make a goodly show for 6pence, and she laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous collars, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honor of the day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in the fashionable parks. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they'd smelt the goose and known it for their very own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onions, danced about the table and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud, although his collars nearly choked him, blew the slow fires until the potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. Why, whatever has got to you, Father, said Mrs. Cratchit, and Tiny Tim, and Martha warn't as late last Christmas Day by half an hour. Here's Martha, Mother, said a girl, appearing as she spoke. Here's Martha, Mother, hurrah! There's such a goose, Martha. Why, bless my heart alive, my dear, how late you are. We'd a great deal of finish up last night, Mother, and had to clear away this morning. Well, never mind, so long as ye are come. Sit ye down before the fire and have a warm, Lord bless you. No, Martha, here comes Father. Hide, hide. So Martha hid herself. In came little Bob the father, his threadbare clothes darned and brushed up to look seasonable, his comforter dangling before him, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. Why, where's our Martha? Not coming. Not coming? Not coming upon Christmas Day? Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, if it were only in joke. So she ran out prematurely from behind the closet door and into his arms, while the two young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off to the wash house, that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. And how did little Tim behave? Oh, as good as gold and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped that people saw him in the church, because it would be good for them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to a tiny stool beside the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons and put it on the hob to simmer, Master Peter and the two ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Martha dusted the hot plates. Miss Belinda sweetened up the applesauce. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner of the table. The two young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves. And Martin, guard upon their posts, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were all set on, and grace was said. This was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the knife, prepared to plunge it into the breast. And when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight rose all round the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah, hurrah! Oh, there never was such a goose." Bob said he didn't believe there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and size, flavor and cheapness were themes of universal admiration. Eked out by applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said, with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish, they hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the two young Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onions to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being cleared by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have gotten over the back wall and stolen it while they were making merry with the goose. A supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. Smelling a washing day. That was the cloth. Smelling of laundresses and the pastry cooks next door to each other, with an eating house next door to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with a pudding like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, glazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck into the top. Oh, wonderful pudding! Bob Cratchit said, and calmly too, that he regarded it as the greatest success of Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now the weight was off her mind. She had had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody said something about it, but nobody said or thought that it was at all a small pudding for such a large family. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last the cloth was cleared, a shovelful of chestnuts was put upon the fire, apples and oranges on the table, and the family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle. And at Bob's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with beaming looks. A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us, which all the family re-echoed. God bless us, every one, said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side and dreaded that he might be taken from him. I give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast. The founder of the feast, indeed, said Mrs. Cratchit. I wish I had him here. I'd give him such a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I'd hope he'd have a good appetite for it, too. My dear, Christmas Day, the children? Well, it should be Christmas Day, on which one drinks the health of such a stingy, odious, hard-on-made, feeling man as he is. Nobody knows it better than you do, Bob, poor fellow. I'll drink to his health for the day's sake, and the children's, not for his. A Merry Christmas to him and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt. The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which had no heartiness in it. Scrooge was the ogre of the family. The mere mention of his name cast a dark shadow upon the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. When it was, though, they were 10 times merrier than before, from the mere relief of Scrooge the Baleful being done with. Bob told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6pence weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Peter's being a man of business. And Peter himself looked thoughtfully at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating what particular investments he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do and how many hours she had to work at a stretch and how she meant to lie abed tomorrow morning for a good long rest. Tomorrow being a holiday, she passed at home. Oh, and how she'd seen a countess and a lord some days before, and the lord was much about as tall as Peter. At which Peter pulled up his collar so high, you couldn't have seen his head if you'd been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round and round, and by they had a song from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There is nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. Their clothes were scanty, their shoes were far from being waterproof. Peter might have known, and very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded and looked happier yet in the sprinkling spirit torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them all, especially Tiny Tim, until the very last. It was a great surprise to Scrooge as this scene vanished to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room with the Spirit standing smiling by his side, looking at that same nephew. It is a fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things that while there is infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humor. And when Scrooge's nephew laughed, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, not a bit behind, laughed out loudly. He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live. He believed it, too. More shame for him, Fred. She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised, capital-looking face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, as no doubt it was, all kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in any little creature's head. Altogether, she was what you would call provoking. Oh, but satisfactory, too. Perfectly satisfactory. He's a comical old fellow, that's the truth, said Scrooge's nephew, and not so pleasant as he might be. Here, he takes it into his head to dislike us and won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He don't lose much of a dinner. Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner, interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, and they must be allowed to have been competent judges, for they had just had dinner, and with dessert upon the table, were seated about the fire by lamplight. Well, I'm very glad to hear it, said Scrooge's nephew, because I haven't any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper? Topper clearly had his eye on one of Scrooge's niece's sisters, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on such a subject, whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one with the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family and knew what they were about when they sang a glee or a catch, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one and never swell the large veins in his forehead or get red in the face over it. They didn't devote the whole evening to music. After a while, they played at forfeits, for it is good to be children, and never better than at Christmas, when its mighty founder was a child himself. Oh, there was first a game of blind man's buff, though. And I no more really believe that Topper was blinded than I believe he had eyes in his boots, for the way he went after the plump sister in the lace tucker was an outrage on the credulity of human nature, bumping up against the piano, knocking over the chairs, tumbling up against the fire irons, smothering himself in the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He wouldn't catch anybody else. If you bumped up against him and stood there, as some of them did, he would have made a feint of endeavoring to seize you and then instantly sidled off in the direction of the plump sister. Here is a new game, Spirit. 1/2 hour, only one. It's a game called Yes and No, where Scrooge's nephew had to think of something, and the rest must find out what. He answering to their questions yes or no, as the case was. The fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, a disagreeable animal, a live animal, an animal that growled and grunted and talked sometimes, and lived in London and walked about the streets, wasn't led by anybody, didn't live in a menagerie, was never killed in a market, and was not a horse or an ass or cow or bull or pig or tiger or dog, cat or a bear. At every question that was put to him, this nephew burst into a fresh roar of laughter and was so inexpressibly tickled, he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp. At last the plump sister cried out, I know what it is, Fred. I know what it is. It's your Uncle Scrooge. Which indeed it was. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to, "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes. Uncle Scrooge had imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have drank to the unconscious company in an inaudible speech. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last word spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw and far they went. Many homes they visited, but always with a happy ending. The spirit stood by sick beds, and it was cheerful. By poverty, and it was rich. In almshouse, jail, hospital, misery's every refuge, where some vain person in their little brief authority could not bar the spirit out, he left his blessings and taught Scrooge his precepts. Suddenly, as they were standing together in an open place, the clock struck 12. Scrooge looked about him for the ghost, but saw him no more. As the last stroke of 12 ceased to vibrate, he remembered the prediction of old Jacob Marley, and lifting up his eyes, beheld a phantom, draped and hooded, coming along the ground like a mist towards him. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near him, Scrooge got down upon his knee, for in the air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. I am in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come. Ghost of the future, I fear you more than any specter I have seen. But as I know you come to do me good, and as I hope to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear you company and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me? It gave him no reply. The hand was pointed straight before them. Lead on, spirit, lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me, I know. Lead on, spirit. They scarcely seemed to enter the city, for the city rather seemed to spring up about them. But they were in the center of it, on 'change amongst the merchants. Observing that the hand was pointed to a small knot of businessmen, Scrooge advanced to listen to their talk. "No, I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "Good heavens! When did he die?" "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him? I thought he'd never die." "God knows." "What's he done with all his money?" "Company, perhaps. That's all. I hasn't left it to me. That's all I know. Bye-bye." Scrooge was first inclined to be surprised that the ghost should attach importance to conversation seemingly so trivial. But sensing that it must have some importance, he set himself to consider what it might be. It could scarcely be in reference to the death of his old partner, Jacob Marley, for that was past. This ghost province was the future. He looked about for his own image. But another man stood in his accustomed corner, and though the clock pointed to the hour of day for his usual being there, he saw no likeness of himself among the multitudes that poured in through the porch. Gave him little surprise, however, for he had been revolving in his mind a change of heart, and he hoped he saw his newborn resolutions carried out in this. They left this busy scene and went to an obscure part of the town, to a low shop where bottles, bones, rags, and greasy offal were bought. A gray-haired rascal of great age sat smoking a pipe. Scrooge and the ghost came into the presence of this man just as a woman slunk into the shop carrying a heavy bundle. She had scarcely entered when she was followed by another woman similarly laden, and she was followed by a man in faded black. After a period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, They all three burst into a fresh roar of laughter. Let the charwoman alone to be the first, the laundress alone to be the second, and the undertaker's man alone to be the third. Look here, old Joe, if we all three had met here without meaning it, you were made free even long ago, and the other two ain't strangers. What have you got to sell? What have you got to sell? Half a minute's patience, Joe, and ye shall see. What odds then, Mrs. Dilber? What odds then? Every person has the right to take care of themselves. He always did. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose. No, indeed, ma'am. If he was natural in his lifetime, a wicked old screw, why, he'd have had somebody with him, instead of lying there gasping out alone when death struck him. Stronger words, Mum, couldn't be said. It's a judgment upon him. I could have been a much stronger judgment if I could have gotten my hands on anything else. Open the bundle, Joe. Speak out plain. I ain't afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to hear. Old Joe got down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening the bundle and dragged out a large roll of heavy, dark stuff. What do you call this? Bed curtains. Ah, bed curtains. Don't drop that oil on them blankets now. His blankets? He isn't likely to take cold without him, I dare say. You may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it, nor a threadbare place. It's a fine one, too, the best one he had. They'd have wasted it by dressing him up in it, if it hadn't been for me. Scrooge listened to this dialogue in horror. But the case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this? And now almost touched a bare, uncurtained bed. A pale light rising on the outer air fell straight upon it, and lying there unwatched, unwept, uncared for, the plundered body of this unknown man. Spirit, let me see some tenderness connected with this chamber, or this death will be forever present to me. The ghost conducted him to Bob Cratchit's dwelling, the same place he had visited before. He and the ghost crossed the threshold and found Mrs. Cratchit and the girls seated, and the children seated about the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The two noisy young Cratchits sat still as statues in one corner, looking up at Peter, who held a book before him. But surely they were very quiet. And he took a child and set him in the midst of them. Where had Scrooge heard those words? He'd not dreamt them. The boy must have read them as he and the ghost crossed the threshold. Why did he not go on? Mrs. Cratchit and the girls were seated by the lamplight by fire, and she laid the needlework that she was on down. The color hurts my eyes, she said. The color? Ah, poor Tiny Tim. It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It is past his time. He's walked rather slowly these last few evenings, Mother, much slower than he used. I have known him walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed. And so have I, and so have I, and so had all. But he was very light, and your father loved him so that it was no trouble. And here is your father at the door. In came little Bob, the father. His tea was ready for him on the hob. Each tried who should help him to it the most. Then two young Cratchits got each child upon his knee and laid a little cheek against his face as if to say, "Don't mind it, Father. Don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them. He looked at the work upon the table and praised the speed and industry of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls. It would be done long before Sunday, he said. Sunday? You went today then, Robert? Yes, my dear. I wish you could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. I promised him that I would walk there on a Sunday. My little child, my little child. He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. If he could have helped it, he and his child would have been farther apart, perhaps, than they were. Spirit, something informs me that our moment of parting is at hand. I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man that was with a face covered, whom we saw lying dead. The spectre led him to a dull, wretched, ruinous churchyard, stood among the stones and pointed down to one. But before I draw nearer to the stone to which you point, Spirit, answer me one question. Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they the shadows of the things that may be only? The kind hand was immovable as ever. One's courses will foreshadow certain events to which, if persevered, the ends will come. But if the courses are changed, the ends will change. Say it is thus with what you show me. The ghost did not move. Scrooge got down upon his knee and, following the finger, read upon the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. Oh, no, Spirit, no, I am not the man I was. Hear me, I am not the man I must have been but for this intercourse. Why show me this if all hope is past? For the first time the kind hand faltered. I shall honor Christmas all the year. The spirits of past, present, and future shall strive within me. Oh, tell me that I may sponge away the writing on this stone. Holding up his hands in one last prayer to have his fate reversed, he noticed an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a bedpost. Yes, the bedpost was his own. The bed was his own. The room was his own. Best and happiest of all, the time was his own to make amends in. Running to the window, he opened it and looked out. No mist, no night, no fog, clear, bright, stirring, golden day. What's today? Cried Scrooge down to a boy in his Sunday clothes who perhaps had loitered in to look about him. Eh? What's today, my fine fellow? Today, why, Christmas Day. It's Christmas Day. I haven't missed it. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello. Do you know the poulterer's in the next street but one at the corner? I should hope I did. An intelligent boy, a remarkable boy. Do you know whether they've sold a prize turkey there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one. What, the one as big as me? Yes, me buck. It's hanging there now. Is it? Well, go and buy it. Walker, no, I'm in earnest. Go and buy it. Tell the man to bring it here, that I may tell him where to send it. Come back with the man. I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes. I'll give you half a crown. Boy was off like a shot. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's. He shan't know who sent it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim. Old Joe Miller never made such a joke as sending it to Bob's will be. The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it somehow he did, and went downstairs to open the street door for the coming of the poulterer's man. It was a turkey, that bird. Never could have stood upon its legs. Would have snapped them off short in an instant, like sticks of sealing wax. At last Scrooge got dressed all in his best and went forth on the streets which were pouring forth with people as he had seen with the ghost of Christmas present. Scrooge walked down the street with his hands behind him, and regarded each and every person with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly good-humored that a few good-humored fellows said, "Good morning, sir. A Merry Christmas to you." And Scrooge said often afterwards that of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. In the afternoon he made toward his nephew's house. He crossed the door a dozen times before he had enough nerve to knock, but he made a dash and did it. "Hello, my dear." "Hello. Nice girl, very. Is your master in, my dear?" "Yes, sir. He's in the dining room along with mistress." I'll go in. He knows me. I know where I'm going." "Fred?" "Why, bless my soul, who's that?" "Fred, it's I, your Uncle Scrooge. Will you let me in?" "Let him in." It was a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. Scrooge was at home in 5 minutes. Scrooge's niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did the plump sister when she came. So did everybody when they came. Wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. Oh, but he was early at the office the next morning. If he could get there first and catch Bob Cratchit coming late, that was what he had his heart set on. And he did it. The clock struck 9. "No, Bob." 1/4 past. "No, Bob." Bob was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. His hat was off. His comforter, too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock. "Hello," growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it. "What do you mean by coming in here this time of day?" I am sorry, sir. I am behind my time." Yes, I think you are. Now step this way, if you please." I was making rather merry yesterday, sir." "I'm sure you were. Now, I'm not going to stand for this sort of thing any longer. And therefore, I'm about to raise your salary." Bob trembled and got a little nearer to the ruler. "A Merry Christmas, Bob. A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year. I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family over a smoking bowl of Christmas bishop this very afternoon. Bob Cratchit, you buy another coal shovel before you dot another I." Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He was as good a man, as good a master, as good a friend as the good old city knew, or any other good old city, town, or borough in the good old world. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but his own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. He had no further intercourse with spirits, but lived in that respect upon the total abstinence principle forever afterwards. And it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas if anyone alive possessed the knowledge. May that be said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, every one.